Hey guys, it's Makeshift. Today I'm going to share some tips on how to do embroidery over an applique seam like this. So this is Bob from Animal Crossing, and one of his eyes is over this purple spot that he has here. And it can be a little tricky to do this embroidery because you have to first do the applique and then you have to do the eye embroidery on top of that. So I'm going to show some tips on how I get this done. I'm going to work in Embroidery for the first part, but regardless of your embroidery program, you'll be able to use the tips that I share in that segment. So let's get started. Here I am in Embroidery. It's my embroidery program of choice, and even though the buttons I'm going to press are specific to Embroidery, you can still use the principles that I talk about to make it in your own embroidery program. So here in Embroidery, I have Bob's face embroidery. This area on the right side is going to be applique, but his eye right here needs to go over that appliqued seam. Of course, this is going to need to be the first thing that we do when we stitch out this face. So you could just do a full applique piece and have the satin stitch run through this eye, but the problem with that is the satin stitch will show up underneath this embroidery and look a little domed in the area where the stitches would go over this satin stitch. The other reason you don't want a satin stitch going through the eye is because it can make doing the eye embroidery more difficult, where maybe your stitches will break when it's trying to go over the additional layer of tight stitches right here in this area. So to prevent that from happening, what we do is break up this applique piece into different sections. Now in Embroidery, the applique has to connect. So if I were to select this applique object, I would have to make a connected object. What that means is that the beginning points and the ending points have to meet. It has to be a closed form. Now, this is not a closed form over here because I do not have the satin stitches joining at the beginning and the end of the stitch. That means that I have to make it on my own. First, I need a stitch to mark where my applique fabric needs to land. The second stitch is going to tack down that fabric, and then the third stitch is going to be a satin stitch that goes over the edge of the fabric to give it a cleaner look. So like I mentioned earlier, we don't want that satin stitch to run in this eye area. We do want it to poke a little bit into this eye because we don't want to have a gap between the edge of the satin stitch and the beginning of the eye. But the stitches that first mark where the embroidery will go and the second stitch that tacks down the fabric can run through this eye area. So because I have to make my own applique object because this is not a closed object, I start by selecting the Create Outline object right here in Embroidery, and all I do is click at the beginning where I want the stitch to start, and then you can click at the end, and then you can just drag the little dot to however you want that line to look. Now if it doesn't make a perfect curve like mine, you can right click and you can hit Insert, which is going to add another node that you can adjust further. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just click along the way of your object. So if I click at the start, I can just click along this curved line to make more nodes, ending up at the very end of my curve. And then I can adjust the circles in between them to make the line more curved. But in Embroidery, you want to have as few nodes as possible, but you also get a little bit messier curve, I find, if you do it yourself like this, as opposed to going into the end and then adjusting in the middle by adding more nodes. When you're done with your outline object, just hit the Finish Object button in the top left, but I don't want the one I just made, so I'm going to hit the X. Now this first stitch is going to be the stitch that marks where I want to lay down my purple fabric. My purple fabric is going to stick out a little bit beyond where this stitch goes, but I need to tack it down right in this same area. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this exact line that I just made. Just hit Control C and Control V, and then it's going to make a copy here on the right. Now because this is tacking down fabric, I want to make the stitches shorter than what they are by default. So I'm going to right click it and hit Parameters, and then I'm going to decrease the max length. You can do 0.7, which is the minimum, so this is just going to make it a 0.7 millimeter stitch. It's a fine width. You can make it even 1 if you didn't want it to be super short, but anything less than the 2 is fine. I've done 2 as well, but just to be more safe with tacking down your fabric, you can do a shorter stitch. So then I'm going to hit OK. So there are a couple different ways how to make the satin stitch. The first is just to do it manually and use this column object button right here. Satin stitches are called columns in Embroidery. So if you click on it, you need to first start by setting the 2 endpoints, and so these are going to be either side of the satin stitch, and then you would click one side and start drawing along the line of the satin stitch that you want, very similarly to how we drew the outline, and then you want to end it just inside the eye. Again, you don't want to end it just at the end because 1, you don't want to have a little gap in between the satin stitch of the applique and where the eye starts, and 2, it's going to allow for a little bit of pull compensation. Pull compensation is accounting for the stretch of the minky or the fleece, where it is going to change and distort a little bit just because of the make of the fabric. So then you would click the other side of the satin stitch and then go ahead and do the same process. Once you're done, you can just hit the finish object and then you'd have a satin stitch. But my favorite way to make a column is just to go to one of the outline stitches that we made and highlight it, and then go to convert and create column from outline. So then you can just create a column using that outline as a guide, and you can make it however wide you want. So I typically make my applique 3 millimeters wide because it allows for some extra wiggle room in grabbing that fabric that we're going to cut, and then just hit OK, and then it's going to make the satin stitch. Now, like I said, because this goes through the eye, we're going to have to make some adjustments. So first I'm going to copy it and make a second one. Then I'm going to take the first one and I'm going to start deleting nodes until it gets close to the eye, which this one is. So I'm going to click on the other one and then just hit delete on my keyboard, and then I'm going to zoom in and then just adjust this endpoint to come right inside the eye. And then I'm going to hit the finish object. Now I'm going to hit the second one, and this one's going to be a little bit weird because I have to go from the other end, but because this is where I started, it doesn't like me to delete these. So if I hit delete, nothing's going to happen. So I'm going to delete the next ones, and then I'm going to drag these endpoints over to where I want it to end, and then I'm going to have to also grab these little circles in between. And then I'm just going to hit finish object. So now I have my satin stitch that is not going to be intruding with the eye underneath it. So a couple other things. One is that we need these stitches to stop in between when we are going to run the outline stitch and then the tack down stitch. And the easiest way to do that is just to change the color of the object that makes the outline stitch and the satin stitch. I prefer to make it the color of the thread I'm going to use, just in case that I forget. So I'm going to highlight both the outline object and the satin stitch. I'm going to right click, go to color, define color, and then I'm just going to pick purple. So this is just a quick way to tell your machine to stop stitching when it switches to the outline object, because if all of these were the same color, it would just sew them back to back and you wouldn't get an opportunity to actually lay your fabric down. So from here you can go ahead and design your eye or whatever else you're going to be stitching on top of your applique seam. I'm not going to go over that because I have an in-depth video on designing eyes in Embroidery, and it's going to be specific to whatever embroidery program that you use. So just to show you what it would look like, again, you would want to do this first, so I'm just going to select them all and drag it up to be the first objects that I stitch out. And then from here you would want to go ahead and design the rest of your embroidery. You would want to do the eye or whatever object is going to cross over this applique seam, and then any other stitches. I also like to outline the shape of my pattern piece so that it's not as difficult to align when I need to cut it out. So then you can compile it and save it as your desired file format for putting it on your sewing machine, and then we can go ahead and stitch it out. So now I'm ready to do the applique onto my fabric. So what I have here is a paper template of the face printed out, and I printed this out from Embroidery. It also has a centering object on it. If you don't have a printer, or if your embroidery program doesn't have this feature, you can just determine the center of your embroidery yourself. But I find it very easy to print this out and just to poke some holes through this centering object, and then I can lay it on top of my fabric and mark with a air-soluble fabric pen where the center is. You'll notice that my fabric is cut larger than my pattern piece, and that's just because I want to have a little bit of extra wiggle room in hooping my fabric, because if it's off a little bit from the center, this will end up stitching out a little bit off center, and I don't want to have to redo this. So just by sacrificing a little bit of extra fabric, I'm going to save fabric overall in the end from making mistakes. So now I have my little centering object here, but you'll also want to cut out your applique pieces. So I have my pieces here. I have this little spot right here, and then I also have this larger piece for the big piece of his head up here. So now I can go ahead and hoop this fabric. So because this piece is so large, I'm using my large hoop, which is a 5x12. It has 3 different centering areas on the side of the hoop so that I can place it in 3 different positions, so I can kind of cheat and make the embroidery area of my machine bigger than it actually is. I'm going to float the fabric in the hoop instead of hooping the fabric, purposely because on my pattern piece, this is a very large area on the side of the head, and I want to trim off the extra light purple fabric away from underneath the dark purple. I don't want to have 2 layers of minky to embroider through for a couple of reasons. One is that it's hard to embroider over more layers of minky. You'll find that your thread starts breaking, you'll get inconsistent results. And 2, when I'm sewing this together, I don't want to have 2 layers of minky to join. It's just not going to give me the intended results. It might stretch differently because 2 layers aren't going to be as stretchy on top of each other than just one. Because I want to trim underneath it, I can't have this fabric hooped into the hoop. I'm going to need to be able to trim it off. So for that reason, I'm going to float my fabric, which just means it's not going to be placed inside of the hoop. So I am only going to hoop my stabilizer, which I have cut out here, and I just use a little piece of cardboard to place the stabilizer on it, and then I take my basting adhesive here, give it a good shake, and then I spray this on the cardboard as opposed to spraying it in the hoop, because I don't want my hoop to get gummy over time. So now I'm just going to hoop this piece of stabilizer. Give it a good push to make sure that it is secure. If you need some advice on hooping, you can check out another one of my videos that I have for tips on how to hoop fabric. So again, I've just hooped the stabilizer here, and now I need to place the fabric on top of this. So I need to mark the center of this hoop, and you can do this in several different ways, but I find it easiest to just take the little guide that they included with the hoop and use my pen to mark the center. And unfortunately the dots don't go through in the square, so I can just lift it and mark it myself. So that is about the center of my hoop, and my embroidery is oriented this way. So I'm going to take my fabric and make sure that the pile of the minky and the cut is laying the appropriate way. And I'm just going to lay them on top of each other. Just double check. Looks good. So because I sprayed the stabilizer, it has a good stick on here and I don't feel like it's going to wiggle around. If you are feeling uncertain about it, you could take some painter's tape or just scotch tape and tape the edges, so we'll do that too. So I just have some scotch tape and I'm going to tape the edges down. And you only want to do this if you're sure that your edges aren't going to be grabbed by your embroidery machine, because you don't want this getting caught under your needle. So now it's extra secure, and now I can take this over to my embroidery machine and get started. So I have my hoop in my machine, and now I have it ready to go to where it's just going to stitch the first line, which is the outline. Now we got to take it out and cut the fabric. So with my outline stitch, now I know where I need to lay down my applique fabric, and then I also know where I need to trim the fabric underneath. So I'm just going to take a pair of scissors and cut about 1/4 inch beyond the outline. I don't want to go too close, because if I get right up on this outline, I could end up having a gap between my applique fabric and my fabric underneath, which means that this could separate over time. The stitches could come apart and then you could end up with a hole in your piece. So now you just take your applique piece that you cut out, and again, you also want this to be larger than your final piece because you want to have that extra wiggle room around your pattern at the edges. So if this is a little bit off center, then you're not running out of fabric. But then you also want to go beyond this outline because you want to trim it to fit around the edge, because if it got too close, again, you could have a gap. So we're just going to lay this on top, and then you can take your pattern piece and double check that it's going to be enough room all around the edges. And you can do that by looking at where your outline stitches with where your satin stitches and lining up the center of that. And then you can lay your applique on top. This gets kind of tricky. And then with all the extra fabric we've cut, then we know we're not going to run out of fabric when we end up trimming this in the end. Now, if you wanted to, you could tape this down again, just for some extra security. But I would not recommend taping on this side, because you're going to be doing stitching right around here, and again, you don't want your needle catching the tape. And I would also not recommend using the spray stabilizer, because if you spray the fabric itself, I find that it gets really gummy and you can't really get it off of the fabric, and it just stays on there and it gives it a really nasty texture that is very difficult to sew through, and it can gum up your needle as well. So now we can take this back to the embroidery machine and continue our applique. So again, my hoop is in the machine and I'm ready to do my second stitch, which is the tack down stitch. So now we get to take it out of the machine again, and we have to trim this excess fabric past the tacking stitch. So again, this is going to be kind of an awkward angle, because I feel like it's easier to do this when it's close to your body as opposed to sitting it on a table or something, but you need to take some scissors and trim just outside of this tacking stitch. You want to get as close as possible, but you don't want to snip into this tacking stitch because then this applique fabric can start to tear apart from the stitch and then you can end up with a gap. So I like to start with a larger pair of scissors, and you gotta make sure they're really sharp. And then I will grab one end of the fabric and then just kind of start a snip, and then pinch the one cut that you just made and glide your scissors along this cut just to get it started. And then I take a pair of curved embroidery scissors, which are these, which have this really weird shape to them. But this is going to let you get really close to the fabric without cutting into it, and it just gives you a nice clean cut right along these stitches. So because I'm right-handed, I find it easier to do it from the right angle, and then I just press the scissors up against the stitch like this, and then try to just cut the top fabric, the applique fabric, but not the fabric underneath it. So I also find that if you apply some pressure against the applique fabric, that it helps you get close to the stitches as well. And you'll feel some resistance from the stitches where you can't really push too much farther beyond it. And I just do shallow little cuts and then just kind of throw away the extra fabric from time to time. Also, if you take your other hand and push against the stabilizer, it'll help you get close as well. So at certain angles, when my knee isn't supporting it, I need to use my other hand, and times like this where I wish I had 3 arms. That's actually all the time. There's lots of helpful things I'd be able to do with 3 arms. Okay, so then just kind of shake off your extra minky, and then you can evaluate your cut line. And I think I might go again right here at the edge, but the rest of it's looking good. And this area out here is beyond where my stitches are, so I know this is just going to be cut off with the pattern piece, so I'm not too worried about what's going on past that area. All right. Okay, so now we can finish this up. I have to do another piece of applique because Bob has 2 spots on his face, but this one is not going to have any embroidery on it, so I'm going to quickly do that and then get this under the hoop, also with some water-soluble stabilizer. So I got my other spot done, and because I'm done with tacking on fabric for applique, I went ahead and laid a sheet of water-soluble stabilizer on the top of everything. I've also taped it down with some Scotch tape to keep it from wiggling, but again, this is outside of my embroidery area and there is no risk of it getting caught by the needle. I do recommend the Solvy brand of water-soluble stabilizers. I've tried some other ones in the past and I don't like them nearly as much. So this is a necessity if you are going to be embroidering on top of minky or fleece, because the fabric will sink when you stitch on top of it. The stitches will sink into the fabric and it won't come out as intended, and it'll also look a lot messier because the little fibers can stick through the stitches. So now we can just place this in and start executing the rest of our embroidery. So I'm ready to start the third stitch, which is going to be the satin stitch, and you're going to notice how it's going to jump in between an area, which is where the eye is going to end up being, and eventually we're going to want to cut that jump before moving on to the eye embroidery. Alright, so now I'm going to trim these jumps here. And now I can go ahead and do the eye embroidery, which I won't show the whole thing because it's going to take a long time, but I'll put in a couple quick shots of it, and then we will finish up after it's all done. So here it is all stitched together. It's nice and clean where the line of the applique runs through the eye. We don't have any bulk from the stitches that would be here if we had ran the satin stitch all the way through the eye. Everything is placed accurately and looks nice and clean. So we can go ahead and finish up our pattern piece as needed. For me, this is just going to involve tracing my pattern on top of my applique piece here. I prefer to do it on the back side so I can draw on the stabilizer rather than the fabric where I can. So I'm just going to use my printed piece and line up the applique with the pattern piece. And then I also have these additional outline stitches on the side to further help me align this pattern piece with what I've embroidered. So I'll just trace around the edges with a air-soluble fabric pen. And then I can go ahead and cut this out. So here it is all finished. Hopefully you guys learned something today. This can be a tricky little thing to get a hang of, especially if you're new to doing embroidery and appliques. So thanks for watching today, and see you next time. Bye-bye.